In this video, we'll talk about how to configure your main queries within Maven. So the queries that you see here, and when you execute using the execute query button, how do we get this data to display? So let's talk about how to do that. To configure Maven, you can go into the Tools Configure menu, and this will bring up a configure window, and each quadrant within Maven, you'll notice, corresponds to a different node here. So we've got our info quadrant, which is denoted here, and we have our main quadrant, we have our user information quadrant, and we have our system information quadrant. Let's focus in on the main quadrant. So you can see here that I've actually have defined three queries, which you saw in the drop-down box prior to me executing the query. And if I click on one of these queries, you can see the query text, what will be displayed here, the query name, which is the internal name to Maven, the source information about the actual database, as well as the query itself. And we also have this domain information, which allows us to essentially document all of the LDAP paths to every single domain within our forest. So if you have multiple domains within a forest, you'll see them all listed in here. And the reason that we have the entire LDAP string is that you can actually specify a unique domain controller if you happen to prefer a specific DC and for some reason your Active Directory sites don't honor that information. So let's have a look at our main query. So the query that is executed that presents us with the information that you saw in the main grid can be seen right here. So if you're familiar with SCCM or SMS, you can see that we've done a inner join with some different tables to display the information here. You can also see that we have defined the different columns that make up this query. So even though within SMS or SCCM the computer name is known as name 0, we actually want to change that to computer name. So by changing the text of each column, we can actually change what the analyst will see within our grid. So you can see the different values that I've selected here. Now you've also noticed that there are variable names that can be defined within each column, and these variable names are very important because they allow us to pass the value of the specific cell to a menu. And you can see on our menus tab that we actually have, for example, for our main query, here is a ping command. And you can see the menu text here for ping is ping. We have a command which says launch CMD, and then we have parameters, which is /k, which is keep up the CMD window, ping, and you can see we're actually using the percent computer name percent variable. Percent computer name percent is an example of a built-in Maven variable. We also have percent username percent, we have percent IP address percent, and we also have percent group name percent and percent user domain and computer domain, which are reserved for when you want to actually include the domain name for the user or computer in your database and in your queries. Now we'll talk about variable names a little bit more when we get into creating actual menu items, real-time query and menu items in a different video. But for now, I want to mention that you can in fact create your own variable names by simply going into the specific column and specifying a value. So for example, you can see here that I've created a variable name for the MAC address called %MAC%. And you'll see how we use that a little bit later when we create a menu. Now you also notice that there are 3 queries defined within my SQL queries within my data grid view for my all systems. Now there can only be one default query, and if you click on the top node, for example main, you can see that you can actually select which query you would like to be the default query. And this allows you to make sure that when people go into Maven that their default query is already present here and they just have to click the execute query button. Now of course if we open up the info node, you can see that we have 2 subnodes in here, one my work, which is just for our internal tree view for the my work personal support storage system, but we also have our data grid view, and we've got a couple of queries defined in here. So it's really the same concept. The info quadrant and the main quadrant are really the same kind of thing. You configure them the exact same way. You can also, of course, specify which is your default query. So for example, we have selected SCCM advertisements, and within our data tab here, you can see that this is in fact our default